If you have nowhere left to go, even the coldest door can feel like salvation. Clara Hayes whispered to herself as the rain soaked through her thin coat, the fabric clinging to her skin like a second layer of despair, while the towering iron gates of Whitmore Estate loomed before her, unmoving, indifferent, as though the world behind them did not belong to the same reality as the one she had just been cast out from. Her boots, worn and splitting at the seams, barely held together as she climbed the final stone steps, each one slick with rain, each one demanding more strength than she had left. Yet she did not stop, because stopping meant returning to nothing, and nothing was colder than this storm. The wind howled across the grounds, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and old trees, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and distant like a warning she chose to ignore. She lifted her trembling hand and knocked, once. Then again, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm, and for a moment she thought no one would come, that this place, like all the others, would turn her away without even seeing her face. But then the door opened, slow, deliberate, revealing a dimly lit hall where shadows stretched long across marble floors, and in that silence stood a man who seemed carved from the same stone as the house itself. Alexander Whitmore did not move immediately, his tall frame still, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp and gray like winter skies that had forgotten how to thaw. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and utterly without warmth. "You are not expected," as though expectation was the only thing that granted a person the right to exist. Clara straightened despite the cold biting into her bones, her chin lifting just enough to meet his gaze, and though her hands trembled, her voice did not when she answered, "I know." And that was all. No plea, no explanation, no attempt to soften the reality of what she was, someone with nothing left. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, thick with something unspoken, because he had seen desperation before, had turned it away without a second thought. Yet this was different, not because she was stronger, but because she did not beg, and that absence unsettled him in a way he did not immediately understand. Rain dripped steadily from her hair, pooling at her feet, marking her presence against the pristine stone, and still she did not move, as if she had already accepted whatever decision he would make, as if the outcome no longer belonged to her. Behind him, the house breathed quietly, a vast, hollow place untouched by warmth, untouched by laughter, untouched by anything that might resemble life. And for a fleeting moment, something shifted in his gaze, something small and sharp and quickly buried beneath years of practiced indifference. "You have nothing to offer me," he said finally, the words precise, final, meant to close the door before it ever truly opened. Yet she did not lower her eyes, did not retreat, did not break, and in that quiet defiance, in that refusal to collapse, there was something he could not dismiss. Another second passed, then another, until with emotion so slight it might have been imagined, he stepped aside, the space between them widening just enough to allow her through. And though he would never call it mercy, though he would never admit it was anything more than a decision made in passing, the moment Clara Hayes crossed the threshold, something in the silent halls of Whitmore Estate shifted, as if the storm outside had found its way in, not to destroy, but to awaken what had long been left untouched. The warmth inside the estate did not reach her immediately, as if the cold had followed Clara Hayes across the threshold and settled into her bones with quiet persistence, while the door closed behind her with a final, echoing weight that felt less like shelter and more like a boundary she could not cross again. A servant appeared almost instantly, summoned not by a call but by expectation, his expression carefully blank as his eyes flickered over her soaked figure before lowering in practiced indifference, and without a word he gestured for her to follow, leading her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, each lined with dark wood and dim candlelight that flickered against the stone walls like something alive but restrained. Her footsteps were soft against the polished floor, hesitant at first, then steadier, though every movement reminded her that she did not belong in a place where even silence felt deliberate, controlled, almost heavy enough to press against her chest. Behind her, she could feel it, the presence of the man who had allowed her entry, not following, not guiding, but watching. And though she did not turn, She was aware of his gaze in a way that unsettled her more than the storm ever could. The servant stopped at last near a narrow doorway tucked between larger, more imposing halls, opening it to reveal a small room. Simple, clean, untouched by the grandeur that filled the rest of the estate, and he stepped aside with a slight nod that was not quite welcoming but not dismissive either, as though her presence had been accepted without ever being acknowledged. "You will remain here until further instruction," he said, quietly, his voice as controlled as everything else in this house, and Clara inclined her head in return, offering no questions, no protest, stepping inside as the door closed softly behind her, sealing her into a space that felt both like refuge and confinement. She stood there for a long moment, listening, expecting something more, some explanation, some condition, but none came. Only the distant sound of rain against the windows and the faint crackle of fireplaces burning somewhere far. Beyond her reach, she moved slowly, removing her damp coat, her fingers stiff from cold as she placed it carefully over the back of a wooden chair, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she took in the room that was now hers, temporary or otherwise, and though it held little, it was more than she had been given in a long time. Yet something about it, something about the silence pressing in from every direction, made it clear that this was not kindness, not comfort, but something else entirely. Something she could not yet name. Across the estate, in a room far larger and filled with shadows that stretched longer with every flicker of candlelight, Alexander Whitmore stood motionless near the tall windows, his reflection faint against the dark glass as rain traced slow paths downward, his expression unchanged, yet his thoughts less certain than before, because he had made decisions like this countless times, had turned people away without hesitation, had allowed nothing to disrupt the order of his world. And yet this time, there had been a pause, a moment where something had not aligned with the rules he had lived by for years. He exhaled slowly, his hand resting against the cold surface of the window as if grounding himself in something solid, something unchanging. But even that felt less certain now, because somewhere within the walls of his carefully controlled estate, there was a presence that did not fit, a presence that had entered without force, without demand, and had been allowed to stay without reason he could fully justify. And in that quiet realization, something shifted, not enough to break, not enough to be seen, but enough to linger, like the storm outside that refused to pass, settling instead into something deeper, something that would not leave easily once it had taken hold. Morning came without warmth, the gray light filtering through narrow windows as if reluctant to fully enter the estate, and Clara Hayes woke to a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though even the house itself was holding its breath. For a moment she remained still, listening, adjusting to the unfamiliar stillness that carried none of the chaos she had known before, no voices, no hurried footsteps, only the faint ticking of a distant clock marking time in a place where time itself seemed slower, heavier. She rose quietly, smoothing her worn dress with careful hands, aware that everything here demanded precision, restraint, and without being told, she understood that she would be expected to become part of that order without disrupting it. When she opened her door, the corridor beyond stretched long and dim, already alive with movement, servants passing with measured steps, their gazes briefly lifting toward her before quickly looking away, not out of kindness, but out of caution, because she was new, unknown, and in a place like this, that alone was enough to draw silent judgment. A woman older than the rest, her posture sharp and her expression unreadable, approached her with controlled steps, her voice low but firm as she spoke. "You will assist in the East Wing for now," offering no explanation, only direction, and Clara nodded, accepting the role without question, because questions did not belong here. The work began immediately, quiet, repetitive, precise. And though her hands moved with care, her awareness remained heightened, every sound, every shift in the air reminding her that she existed within a world built on rules she had yet to fully understand. Hours passed in measured silence until a faint sound broke through, not loud, not urgent, but different, a soft echo of something misplaced in the stillness. And without thinking, Clara followed it, her steps light as she moved through a narrower passage that seemed less maintained, less observed. The door at the end was slightly open, and inside, she found a small figure seated by a window, unmoving, a child no older than 6, her delicate hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed outward as if waiting for something that never came. Clara paused, uncertain, because no one had mentioned a child, no one had spoken of anything beyond duty and silence. Yet here was a presence that did not belong to either. She stepped closer slowly, careful not to startle, her voice soft when she finally spoke. It is colder near the window. But the child did not respond, did not turn, did not acknowledge her at all. And for a brief moment, Clara felt the weight of that silence more deeply than anything she had encountered since entering the estate. She moved gently, closing the window just enough to soften the draft, then hesitated before placing a folded cloth over the back of the chair. A small, practical gesture, nothing more, yet it felt significant in a place where nothing was ever done without purpose. Still, the child remained quiet, distant, as though sealed behind something unseen, and Clara did not push further, did not demand attention or reaction. She simply remained there for a moment longer, sharing the silence without trying to break it, before stepping back toward the door. But as she turned, something shifted, just barely, a flicker of awareness in the child's gaze, so faint it might have been imagined. Yet it lingered long enough to make Clara pause, her breath catching in a way she did not expect, because in that small, almost invisible moment, she realized that whatever this place had buried, whatever it had silenced, had not been lost entirely, and somewhere beyond the walls, unseen but not unaware, Alexander Whitmore stood in the corridor, his presence hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed on the quiet exchange he had not intended to witness. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he did not step forward, did not interrupt, he simply watched, as something unfamiliar stirred once again beneath the carefully controlled surface of his world. He should have walked away, yet Alexander Whitmore remained where the shadows concealed him, his gaze fixed on the small, quiet room as Clara Hayes stepped back from the child with a restraint that did not match her position, because most would have tried harder, spoken louder, forced a reaction, but she had not, and that absence of demand unsettled him more than any disturbance would have. The girl by the window did not turn fully, yet something in her posture had shifted, a subtle change that only someone who had watched her long enough would notice. And Alexander had watched long enough to understand what silence meant in that room, what it had meant for years, unbroken, unchallenged, until now. He exhaled slowly, stepping forward at last, his presence filling the doorway before Clara could leave, and though she immediately straightened, her hands still, her expression composed, there was no fear in her eyes, only awareness, as if she had sensed him long before he chose to reveal himself. "You were not assigned here," he said, his voice low, precise, carrying the quiet authority that defined every part of this estate. And Clara inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "I heard something," she answered simply, her voice calm, offering no excuse beyond the truth. And for a brief moment, the air between them held still, because he had expected hesitation, perhaps even an apology, but she offered neither. His gaze shifted past her, resting on the child, who had returned her attention to the window, her stillness once again complete, yet not quite the same as before, and that difference, however small, did not escape him. "You will return to your duties," he said after a moment, his tone unchanged, yet something beneath it less certain than before, and Clara nodded, stepping past him without another word, her movements quiet, controlled, as if she had already learned the rhythm of this place, leaving behind only the faint sound of her footsteps fading into the corridor. Alexander remained where he was, his eyes still on the child, his thoughts less ordered than they should have been, because for years nothing had altered this room, nothing had reached her, and yet a single presence, uninvited, untrained, had done what time itself had failed to accomplish. He stepped inside slowly, the floor barely sounding beneath his weight, and the girl did not turn, did not acknowledge him. Yet her small hand moved slightly against the fabric of her dress, a gesture so minimal it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him. "Who was that?" he asked quietly, though he knew she would not answer, had not answered for longer than he cared to admit, and as expected, silence remained. Yet it was no longer the same silence, no longer empty, but holding something just beneath the surface, something that had been disturbed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he turned away, stepping back into the corridor where the order of his world waited, unchanged, structured, predictable. Yet as he moved through it, he became aware of something he had not felt in years, a subtle disruption, like a thread pulled loose from a carefully woven design. Across the estate, Clara resumed her tasks, her hands steady despite the quiet weight that now followed her, because she had not intended to change anything, had not come with purpose beyond survival. Yet something in that room had lingered with her, something she could not ignore, and as the hours passed, she became aware of the way the other servants watched her, their glances sharper, now more deliberate, as if they had sensed the same shift and did not welcome it. Whispers did not form, not openly, but tension moved through the halls in quieter ways, in the way conversations paused when she approached, in the way instructions became shorter, more precise, as if boundaries were being drawn around her without being spoken, and somewhere within that growing tension, unseen but no longer unaffected, Alexander Whitmore found his thoughts returning, again and again, to a moment that should have meant nothing, to a presence that should have passed unnoticed, and to a realization that unsettled him more than he would ever allow to be seen. Because for the first time in years, something within his carefully controlled world had responded, not with resistance, but with something far more dangerous, something that could not be easily dismissed once it had begun. The house did not change, yet Clara began to understand that something within it had, because the silence no longer felt empty but watchful, as if the walls themselves were aware of her presence in a way they had not been before, and though no one spoke of it, the difference lingered in every measured step and every careful glance that followed her through the long corridors. She worked as she had been instructed, precise, quiet, never overstepping, yet the memory of the small room at the end of the narrow hall stayed with her, returning in fragments between tasks, the stillness of the child, the faint shift in her posture, the way something so small could feel so significant in a place built on stillness. By late afternoon, the light outside had dimmed again, clouds gathering low and heavy, pressing shadows deeper into the corners of the estate, and Clara found herself once more near the east wing, her path deliberate this time, though she did not question it, because some things did not require permission, only intention. The door remained slightly open, as though it had been left that way on purpose or perhaps never fully closed at all, and when she stepped inside, the room greeted her with the same quiet, the same faint chill that lingered near the window, yet the child was no longer sitting as before, her small figure now turned slightly inward, her hands resting not in stillness but loosely against her lap, as if something had interrupted the pattern she had held for so long. Clara did not speak immediately, did not move closer than necessary, allowing the silence to settle first, because she had begun to understand that this silence was not empty but fragile, and breaking it too quickly might cause it to retreat again. She crossed the room slowly, adjusting the curtain, just enough to soften the fading light, then placed a small wooden object she had found among unused items in the corridor onto the table beside the child. Nothing elaborate, nothing imposing, simply something to exist in the space between them. The girl's gaze shifted, not fully, not openly, but enough to acknowledge the change, her eyes lingering on the object for a moment longer than anything else in the room. And Clara felt it then, that same subtle shift, that same almost invisible movement beneath the stillness, and this time it did not feel imagined. She stepped back once more, her hands still, her presence quiet, offering nothing beyond the moment itself, and after a few seconds, she turned to leave, her footsteps soft against the floor, until she reached the doorway where she paused, not turning, not expecting anything, and yet behind her, there was a sound, so faint it might have been lost to anyone else. The slight movement of wood against fabric, the smallest indication that the object had been touched. Clara did not react outwardly, did not return, but something within her steadied, something that had been uncertain finding a quiet sense of purpose in a place where purpose had long been absent. In the corridor beyond, Alexander Whitmore stood once again where he should not have been, his presence concealed by shadow and distance, his gaze fixed not on Clara this time, but on the subtle change within the room. because he had seen it clearly now. The difference, the break in a pattern that had remained unchanged for years. And though his expression did not alter, though his posture remained controlled, there was no denying the shift within him, the realization that what he had dismissed as coincidence was something else entirely. His hand tightened slightly at his side before relaxing again. A motion so controlled it betrayed nothing to anyone who might have seen him, yet his thoughts did not settle as easily, because this was not something he could command, not something he could control or predict, and that lack of control unsettled him in a way he had not felt in a long time. Clara moved away down the corridor, unaware of the full weight of what had begun, unaware that each quiet action was unraveling something far larger than she intended. And as the evening deepened and the estate returned to its familiar rhythm of silence and shadow, one truth settled quietly beneath it all, unspoken yet undeniable, that the world Alexander Whitmore had built to remain untouched had already begun to change, and it was not something he could stop by simply looking away. By the third day, the rhythm of Whitmore Estate had begun to settle around Clara Hayes like a quiet, unspoken rule, yet beneath that surface, something continued to shift in ways no one acknowledged but everyone felt, especially in the subtle tightening of glances that followed her and the careful distance others maintained, as though she carried with her an uncertainty they could not name. She moved through her duties with the same precision as before, her hands steady, her presence contained. Yet her awareness extended beyond the tasks themselves, drawn again and again toward the east wing, toward the small room that had become something more than an assignment she had never been given. When she returned that afternoon, the air felt different, not warmer, not lighter, but altered, as though something had been disturbed and had not yet settled back into place. The child sat once more by the window, but the wooden object Clara had left the day before now rested in her hands, held loosely yet deliberately, her fingers tracing its edges in a quiet, repetitive motion that carried more meaning than any words could have. And Clara paused just inside the doorway, not stepping further, not interrupting, because this moment did not belong to her to claim. She remained still, her presence gentle, allowing the space to exist without pressure, and after a few seconds, the child's gaze lifted, not fully, not directly, but enough that Clara could see it, that faint connection that had not been there before, and though no words followed, something had undeniably changed. Clara inclined her head slightly, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for nothing, before moving quietly to adjust the room once more. Her actions simple, practical, never drawing attention, yet always leaving behind a subtle trace of care that lingered after she stepped away. She placed a folded blanket closer to the chair, shifted the position of the table just enough to catch more light, each movement deliberate without appearing so, and when she finished, she did not linger, did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply turned and left, her footsteps soft as they faded into the corridor once again, beyond the doorway. Unseen but not absent, Alexander Whitmore stood at a distance, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the scene he had not intended to witness yet could no longer ignore, because this was no longer a moment, no longer an isolated change, but a pattern forming where none had existed before. His jaw tightened slightly as he watched the child's small hands continue to move, the object no longer abandoned but held, engaged with in a way he had not seen in years, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar pressed against the control he had maintained for so long, something that resembled disbelief but ran deeper than that, something closer to realization. He stepped back before Clara emerged, retreating into the shadows as he always had, but this time the distance did not restore the sense of order he relied on, because what he had seen could not be undone, could not be dismissed as coincidence, and more unsettling still, it could not be controlled. Throughout the rest of the day, his thoughts returned to that room, to that subtle shift, to the quiet presence that had entered his world without force, and yet had begun to alter it in ways he did not understand. And for the first time in years, the certainty he had built around himself felt less absolute, as if a single thread had been pulled loose, threatening to unravel something far larger if left unchecked. And somewhere within that growing awareness, a question formed, one he did not voice, one he did not allow to fully surface, yet it lingered all the same, persistent and unwelcome. because he could no longer deny what was happening, nor could he ignore the quiet truth beginning to take shape beneath it all. That Clara Hayes was no longer simply a presence within his estate, but a force within it, one that had already begun to reach the parts of his world he had believed were beyond change. The tension within Whitmore Estate no longer hid beneath silence. It moved now in quieter currents, in the way conversations ended when Clara Hayes entered a room, in the way instructions were delivered with sharper precision, as though every action she took was being measured against a standard she had never been told. And yet she did not falter, because she had lived too long without certainty to be unsettled by it now. Still, she felt it, the shift growing heavier, more deliberate, as if the house itself was beginning to resist her presence, not openly, not with words, but through the people who served it, through their careful distance and their unspoken disapproval. That morning, as she worked along the east corridor, she noticed it more clearly than before. Two servants pausing just long enough to exchange a glance before lowering their voices when she passed, their expressions composed but not neutral, carrying something colder, something edged with quiet judgment, and Clara did not react, did not slow her steps, because acknowledgement would give it form, and she had learned that some things were better left without shape. Yet the weight of it followed her, pressing into the space around her as she approached the narrow passage once more, the door at the end now fully closed, a difference so small it might have gone unnoticed to anyone else, but not to her. She paused, her hand hovering just above the handle, sensing the shift before she even stepped inside, and when she did, the room greeted her with a stillness that felt tighter, more controlled, as though something had been restored to its former state, yet not entirely. The child sat in the same place, the wooden object still in her hands, but her posture had changed again, more rigid now, her movements slower, as if something had interrupted the fragile connection that had begun to form. Clara stepped forward carefully, her presence softer than before, aware now that what had started could just as easily be taken away. And she knelt slightly beside the chair, her voice low, steady. "You do not have to hold it if you do not want to," offering permission rather than expectation. Yet the child did not respond, her gaze fixed forward once more, the subtle shift from the day before retreating behind something unseen. Clara did not press further, did not attempt to reclaim what had been lost, because she understood now that this was not something that could be forced, not something that would remain simply because it had appeared once. And so she remained there only a moment longer, before rising, adjusting the blanket as she had before, restoring small pieces of quiet without disrupting the fragile balance of the room. But as she turned to leave, the door opened behind her without warning, and the presence that filled the space was unmistakable, immediate, shifting the air with a quiet authority that demanded attention without ever raising its voice. Alexander Whitmore stood in the doorway, his expression composed, yet his gaze sharper than before, no longer distant, no longer observing from the safety of shadow. And for the first time since she had entered his world, he had chosen not to remain unseen. Clara straightened slowly, her hands still, meeting his presence without retreat, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying something heavier than before, something shaped by everything that had already begun to change. His eyes moved briefly past her to the child, noting the difference, the tension that had returned, and though his expression did not shift, there was a flicker of something beneath it, something closer to frustration than indifference, because what had begun could not simply be undone without consequence. "You will not return here," he said finally, his voice controlled, final, the words landing with a weight that did not need to be raised to be understood. And yet beneath that command, there was something else, something less certain, as if the decision itself had not come as easily as it should have. Clara held his gaze for a fraction longer than expected, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, before she inclined her head in quiet acknowledgement. "As you wish." And with that, she stepped past him once more, her movement steady, leaving behind a room that had already begun to change again, though this time not towards something new, but towards something unresolved. Alexander remained where he was, his attention shifting between the child and the space Clara had occupied only seconds before, and in that stillness, the realization settled deeper than before, that control, once absolute, had begun to fracture in ways he could no longer ignore, and the question that followed, though unspoken, pressed against the silence with quiet persistence, not whether Clara Hayes would return, but whether her absence would undo something he was no longer certain he wanted undone. The silence after Clara Hayes left the room did not restore what had been lost. It only made the absence more visible, more defined, as if the space itself recognized what had been removed and could not return to what it had been before. Alexander Whitmore remained standing in the doorway longer than he intended, his gaze fixed on the child who had already retreated into stillness. The small wooden object now resting motionless in her lap, no longer traced by curious fingers, no longer held. With the fragile engagement that had unsettled him only moments ago, he stepped forward slowly, the sound of his shoes against the floor deliberate yet restrained, as though he were approaching something far more delicate than the quiet room suggested. And when he stopped beside the chair, he did not speak immediately, because there were no words he could offer that had ever changed anything here before. His eyes lowered to the object in her hands, his expression unreadable, yet something within it had shifted, something that did not align with the certainty he had relied on for years. "You may put it down," he said at last, his voice calm, controlled, yet the child did not respond, did not move, her silence returning not as emptiness but as something guarded, something closed again, and that difference, however subtle, did not escape him. A flicker of something passed through his gaze, brief and contained, before he straightened, stepping back as though distance might restore what had been disrupted. Yet even as he moved away, he understood that distance no longer held the same power it once had. Across the estate, Clara continued her duties as instructed, her movements precise, her presence quiet, yet the weight of his words followed her more heavily than she allowed herself to show, because she had expected resistance, had expected boundaries, but not this. Not the deliberate removal from something that had barely begun, and though she accepted it without protest, something within her did not settle as easily as before. The corridors felt longer that evening, the air heavier, as if the estate itself had drawn a line she was not meant to cross again. And yet her thoughts returned to that room, to the faint shift she had seen, to the moment that had not been imagined, and she understood now that what had begun was not something she could simply forget because she had been told to step away. The following morning arrived with a colder stillness than before, the sky outside pale and unyielding, and Clara moved through her tasks with the same care, the same restraint, though something within her attention remained divided, pulled toward a place she could no longer enter. As she passed the east corridor, her steps slowed only slightly, her gaze lowering just enough to avoid drawing notice, yet she felt it, the difference in the air, the absence of something that had briefly existed there, and without needing to see it, she knew the room had returned to its former silence. But what she did not see, what she could not know, was that Alexander Whitmore had returned there more than once since the moment she left, his presence no longer confined to observation but drawn by something he could neither dismiss nor fully understand, and each time, he found the same stillness, the same absence of change, as though the brief shift he had witnessed had never occurred at all. It unsettled him in a way that logic could not resolve, because he had seen it clearly, had recognized the difference, and yet without her presence, it had vanished as if it had never been real. And that realization pressed deeper than he allowed himself to acknowledge. By evening, the tension within the estate had sharpened further, no longer hidden beneath careful silence but carried in the posture of those who moved through it, in the way glances lingered longer than before, because something had been noticed, something had been disrupted, and though no one spoke of it, the change had not gone unseen, and in the quiet center of it all, between what had been and what might have been, a truth began to settle with quiet certainty, one that neither Clara nor Alexander could yet fully face, that what had begun in silence could not be undone by command alone, and that the absence now filling the space between them carried a weight far greater than the presence that had first created it. By the fourth day, the absence had become something that could no longer be ignored, not because it was spoken of, but because it lingered in every space that had once held even the faintest trace of change, and nowhere was that absence more visible than in the quiet room at the end of the east corridor. Alexander Whitmore stood there again, though he had given no instruction that required his presence. Though there was nothing within those walls that demanded his attention, and yet he returned. Not once, but repeatedly, as if confirming something he already knew yet refused to fully accept. The child remained as she had been before Clara Hayes had ever entered his world, her posture still, her gaze distant, the small wooden object now placed neatly on the table rather than held, as though the brief connection it had carried had dissolved without leaving a trace. And yet he knew that was not entirely true, because he had seen it, had witnessed the shift with a clarity that could not be dismissed as imagination. He moved closer this time, stopping just within arm's reach, his presence steady, controlled, yet there was something beneath it now, something less certain, something that did not align with the rigid order he had maintained for years. "You held it," he said quietly, his voice measured, not expecting a response, because there had never been one before, and there was none now. Only the same silence that had filled this room for so long, yet it did not feel the same, because now it carried the memory of something that had once broken through it. His hand lowered slightly, as if he might reach for the object, as if he might test whether the absence was complete or if something remained beneath the surface. But he did not complete the motion, withdrawing instead, because uncertainty was not something he allowed himself to act upon. Across the estate, Clara moved through her duties with the same quiet precision, yet the weight of what had been lost settled more heavily with each passing hour, because she did not need to see the room to know what had happened. She understood it in the stillness that followed her, in the way something fragile had been interrupted before it could fully take shape. The servants no longer merely watched her. They avoided her more deliberately now, their distance sharper, more intentional, as if her presence carried consequences they did not wish to be part of. And Clara accepted it without reaction, because she had learned long ago that resistance only gave shape to what others already believed. Yet that acceptance did not quiet the awareness within her, the quiet understanding that something had begun and had been taken away not by chance, but by choice. As evening settled once more over Whitmore Estate, the tension that had built beneath the surface began to shift again, not outwardly, not in any way that could be named, but in something more subtle, more dangerous, because it no longer centered on Clara alone, but on the absence she left behind. Alexander remained in the East Wing longer than he should have, his gaze returning again and again to the same unmoving figure, the same untouched object, as if repetition might restore what had been lost. Yet each moment only confirmed the same truth, that what had changed had not belonged to the room itself, but to the presence that had entered it. And that realization settled with a weight he could not easily dismiss, because it suggested something far more unsettling than the loss of control. It suggested dependence, not of the child, but of the change itself, something that required her to exist. He turned away at last, stepping back into the corridor where the structure of his world remained intact. Yet even there, the certainty felt thinner than before, as if something beneath it had begun to shift beyond his reach. And somewhere within that growing awareness, a question formed more clearly than before, no longer distant, no longer easily ignored, but pressing against the silence with quiet insistence. Because if the presence of Clara Hayes had created something that could not exist without her, then her absence was not a solution, but a fracture, and fractures, once formed, did not remain contained for long. The decision did not come as a command, not at first, but as a disturbance that refused to settle, growing sharper with each passing hour until it could no longer be contained within silence alone. Alexander Whitmore stood once more at the threshold of the East Wing. Yet this time he did not enter, did not allow himself the familiar pattern of observation that had defined his actions in recent days, because repetition had brought no resolution, only confirmation of what he had already begun to understand, that the absence within that room was not natural, not inevitable, but created, and more importantly, sustained by his own command. The corridor stretched before him, long and dim, its shadows unchanged, yet the certainty he had once carried within these walls no longer felt absolute, because something within his control had failed to produce the result he expected, and that failure lingered in a way he could not dismiss. His gaze shifted slightly, not toward the room itself, but toward the direction Clara Hayes had taken since being removed from it. and for a brief moment, the stillness around him held a different weight, one that pressed against the decision he had already made, yet had not yet undone. Across the estate, Clara moved through her duties with the same measured precision, yet the quiet resistance she had accepted now carried a deeper undercurrent, because she had begun to sense that the distance placed between her and that room had not restored what others believed it would, and though she did not seek confirmation, something within her remained unsettled, as if a thread left unfinished continued to pull at her awareness. The servants no longer merely avoided her. They had begun to observe her with something closer to scrutiny, as though waiting for a consequence that had not yet arrived, and Clara did not respond, did not alter her pace, because she had learned that attention, once acknowledged, only grew stronger. Yet even as she maintained her composure, she felt it. The shift within the estate that no longer centered on her presence alone, but on something larger, something that had begun to unravel without clear cause. By late afternoon, the tension had reached a point where silence alone could no longer contain it. Though no voices rose, no confrontation broke the surface, the air itself seemed to hold a question that had yet to be answered. Alexander moved at last, his steps deliberate, not toward the east wing, but away from it, as if the answer he sought no longer resided within that room, but in the absence that had replaced what once existed there. He found her not by chance, but by intent, standing at the far end of a corridor where light from a tall window cast long shadows across the floor, her figure still, her hands occupied with a task that required no thought, only repetition, and when she sensed his presence, she did not startle, did not turn immediately, as if she had expected something, though not necessarily him. "You will return to the east wing," he said, his voice controlled, yet the words carried a weight that had not been there before, not an order given from certainty, but a correction made from recognition, and Clara turned then, slowly, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, without question, because she understood the shift in his words, even if she did not fully understand its cause. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something that had been building since the moment she first crossed the threshold of his world, and though no explanation followed, none was needed, because both understood that something had changed, not within the house alone, but within the decision that had sought to control it. Clara inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and as she stepped past him once more, her movement steady, the quiet truth settled more clearly than before, that what had begun could not simply be undone, and that whatever followed would not be shaped by silence alone. Clara Hayes did not return to the east wing immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood something had shifted beyond simple instruction, and in a place where every action carried consequence, even obedience required precision. When she finally walked the narrow corridor again, her steps were steady, her expression unchanged, yet the air itself felt different, as though the estate had already sensed what was about to unfold, and this time, the door stood closed but not forbidding, no longer a boundary set to keep her out, but something waiting to be crossed once more. She paused only briefly before opening it, the familiar quiet greeting her as she stepped inside, yet it was not the same quiet as before, because beneath it lingered something unfinished, something that had been interrupted and was now waiting, fragile and uncertain. The child sat in the same place, her posture still composed, her gaze distant, yet the wooden object remained where it had been, placed on the table, untouched since Clara had been removed, and for a moment, Clara did nothing, allowing the room to settle around her presence again, allowing the silence to recognize her return. She moved slowly, not toward the child at first, but toward the window, adjusting the curtain as she had done before, her actions familiar, deliberate, offering continuity rather than change, because she understood now that what had begun could not be forced forward, only invited back. The faint shift came gradually, so subtle it might have been overlooked, the child's fingers moving slightly against the fabric of her dress, not yet reaching for the object, not yet repeating what had once occurred, but no longer entirely still. Clara noticed, though she did not react, her attention steady but unintrusive, as she stepped closer, placing her hand lightly against the back of the chair, not touching the child, not demanding awareness, simply existing. within the space again. "It is still here," she said quietly, her voice calm, neither encouraging nor expecting, and though no response came, the words lingered, settling into the room as something familiar rather than foreign. Behind her, unseen but no longer distant, Alexander Whitmore stood once more at the threshold. Yet this time he did not remain hidden, his presence acknowledged by the simple fact that he did not step away, because the decision he had made could not be undone from the safety of shadows. He watched closely, not with the detached observation he had maintained before, but with a focus sharpened by what he had already witnessed and lost. Because this moment was no longer theoretical, no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. It was something that required presence, even if he did not yet understand why. Seconds passed, then more, until at last, the smallest change occurred. The child's hand lifting, hesitating, then reaching toward the wooden object. Once more, her fingers brushing against it with a movement so slight it might have been accidental. Yet it was not, and both Clara and Alexander recognized it for what it was, not a repetition, but a return. Clara did not move, did not acknowledge the moment beyond her stillness, because she understood that recognition could disrupt it just as easily as absence had. And so she remained as she was, quiet, steady, allowing the fragile connection to exist without pressure. Behind her, Alexander exhaled slowly, a motion so controlled it made no sound, yet it carried the weight of realization more clearly than any words could have, because what stood before him could no longer be denied, could no longer be dismissed, and more importantly, could no longer be controlled by distance or command. The room held that moment carefully, as if aware of its own significance, and within it, a truth settled more deeply than before, one that neither of them had fully faced until now, that whatever had begun here did not belong to the structure of the house, nor to the rules that governed it, but to something far more delicate, something that could not be commanded into existence nor forced into absence, something that required only one thing to remain, and that was the quiet presence of someone who had never asked to belong, yet had already become impossible to ignore. The moment did not pass as quickly as it should have. It lingered, fragile yet undeniable, as the child's fingers continued to rest against the wooden object, no longer retreating into complete stillness. And in that quiet persistence, something deeper began to take shape within the room, something that neither silence nor absence could easily undo. Clara Hayes remained where she was, her presence steady, her breathing calm, because she understood now that this was not a moment to claim, not something to acknowledge openly, but something to protect simply by allowing it to exist without interference. The faint light from the window shifted slightly as the afternoon deepened, casting softer shadows across the floor, and within that quiet change, the child's hand moved again, this time not just brushing the object, but holding it more firmly, her fingers curling around it with a hesitant certainty that carried more meaning than any spoken word. Clara lowered her gaze slightly, not to avoid the moment, but to give it space, to ensure that nothing in her expression or movement would disrupt what had taken so long to return. Behind her, Alexander Whitmore did not move, though every instinct within him urged him to step forward, to confirm what he was seeing, to understand it in a way that control could define. Yet he remained still, because he had already learned that presence alone was not enough, that intention could fracture what patience had restored. The air within the room felt different now, not lighter, not warmer, but alive in a way it had not been before, as though something long dormant had been stirred not by force, but by quiet persistence. And that realization settled more heavily within him than anything else, because it challenged everything he had believed about what could and could not be changed. Clara shifted slightly then, stepping back just enough to create distance, not to leave, but to ensure that the moment belonged entirely to the child. And for the first time since she had entered the estate, she allowed herself to remain without purpose, without task, simply present, because she understood now that presence itself was enough. Seconds stretched into minutes, the silence holding steady, no longer fragile, no longer threatened, but grounded in something that had taken root. And within that stillness, a subtle change occurred that neither of them had expected, the child's gaze lifting, not fully, not directly, but enough that it no longer remained fixed on the Window alone, enough that it acknowledged something beyond it. And though her eyes did not meet Clara's, the shift was unmistakable. Clara felt it, the quiet connection that did not require recognition, that did not need to be named, and she remained exactly as she was, because she knew now that this was not something to guide, but something to witness. Behind her, Alexander exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing not from control, but from understanding, because what stood before him was no longer a question, no longer an uncertainty. It was something real, something that existed beyond his influence, and more importantly, something that could not exist without her. The realization settled with a weight that did not overwhelm, but transformed, because for the first time in years, he was not witnessing something fade, but something begin, and that beginning did not belong to him, could not be commanded or contained, yet it was happening within his world, within the walls he had built to remain untouched. Clara turned slightly then, not leaving, but acknowledging the shift in the air, her gaze lifting just enough to meet his across the quiet space. And in that brief, unspoken exchange, something passed between them that neither of them had expected, not gratitude, not obligation, but recognition, a shared understanding that what had been set in motion could not be undone without consequence. And as the light faded slowly into evening, the room held its quiet transformation without demand, without declaration, because some changes did not need to be announced to be real. They only needed to exist long enough to be understood, and once understood, they could never truly be forgotten. The evening did not close around Whitmore Estate as it once had, sealed in silence and untouched by change, because something within its walls had shifted beyond what could be contained, and though no voice declared it, no action confirmed it openly, the difference lived in the air itself, subtle yet undeniable. Clara Hayes stood near the window as the last light of day faded into a muted gray, her posture calm, her presence quiet, yet no longer unseen, because what she had brought into this place was no longer something that could be dismissed or removed without consequence. Behind her, the child remained seated, the wooden object still held in her small hands, her gaze no longer entirely distant, no longer fixed only on what lay beyond the glass, but carrying a faint awareness that had not existed before, fragile yet persistent. And in that quiet persistence, something had taken root that would not easily disappear again. Alexander Whitmore did not retreat into shadow this time, did not distance himself from what had unfolded before him, because he understood now that distance had not preserved his world. It had only hidden the truth from him, and the truth stood clearly before him now, not in grand gestures or sudden change, but in something far more dangerous, something steady, something real. He stepped forward slowly, not with authority, not with command, but with a presence that acknowledged rather than controlled. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the cold finality it once had. "You will remain." The words directed toward Clara, yet shaped by something deeper than instruction, something closer to recognition, because this was no longer a decision made from distance, but one shaped by understanding. Clara turned slightly, her gaze meeting his with the same quiet composure she had carried from the moment she arrived. Yet there was a difference now, not in her expression, but in what stood behind it, because she no longer stood at the edge of his world, uncertain, unseen. She stood within it, not by request, but by presence alone. She inclined her head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of what had already been decided, without words. And for a moment, the silence between them held something new, not tension, not uncertainty, but a quiet equilibrium that had not existed before. The child shifted slightly then, her fingers tightening just enough around the object to draw a faint sound from the wood, and both Clara and Alexander turned toward her, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a stillness that allowed the moment to unfold without pressure. And though no words followed, though no direct acknowledgement came, the movement itself was enough, because it was not a return to what had been, but a continuation of something that had already begun. The house seemed to breathe differently in that moment, not lighter, not warmer, but changed in a way that could not be undone, as though the silence that had once defined it had been reshaped into something that carried meaning rather than absence. Alexander's gaze lingered for a moment longer before shifting back to Clara, And in that glance, there was something he did not speak, something he would not yet name, because it existed beyond the language of command or obligation, something that did not belong to the structure of his world, but to the presence that had entered it without promise, without demand. Clara turned back toward the window, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, because she had not come here to change anything, had not asked to belong. Yet something within this place had responded to her in a way that neither of them could ignore, and as the final traces of daylight disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the estate in quiet shadow, the truth settled without resistance, without declaration, that some things do not arrive with intention. They arrive quietly, unnoticed, until the moment they are gone reveals that they had already become everything, and by then, it is no longer a question of whether they belong, but whether they can ever truly be lost again.